Well, welcome everyone to Brainstorming the Human Connection, brought to you by the South Dakota Humanities Council. My name is Lawrence Diggs. I will be your host and, in some case, interrogator for our guest today. Um, and I'd like to just open this by saying a lot of times when we talk about relationships between people who, for one reason or another, have been divided into various groups, um, we often talk about big events, and those are important to talk about. We often talk about large organizations and particular characters, which are also important to talk about. But a lot of that really has to do and impacts the mostly on the people who are just trying to live their lives out every day. They're trying to do things so that that's relevant to them. And these other large swings in social dynamics affect them and they're adjusting to them. But we don't give nearly enough thought and headspace to the small things that become large things, the things that people do every day that affects the big changes that we start to recognize when we look back at history. And we're going to be talking about one such case today because we have with us Chuck Raasch, uh, who is the author of Life Painted Red, the story of Corabelle Fellows and how her life on the Dakota Frontier became a national scandal. And we're going to be talking about uh, how that not only affected her, but in many ways are part of course, the South Dakota story, but part of our national story because things like this were happening all around. Okay, so Chuck, welcome.
Thank you for having me today. This is exciting.
Let's start off by talking a little bit about who Chuck is.
Mhm.
How did you get started being born and all of that, you know? We don't have to go back to your parents' relationship, but after that, after.
I was born in Watertown, and my dad and mother were farmers until, frankly, till last year. My father passed away last October, and the crop that was harvested in October, some of it he had planted that spring. So I have roots there, but as I point out in the book, probably not as deep as many others, but I still consider to have roots in a little town called Castlewood. It's about 15 miles south of Watertown, and we were talking before here about some of the changes that have undergone this little community and whatever. And so I graduated from high school there. And went to South Dakota State University after a year at here in college. Graduated and became a journalist, and ended up moving to Washington D.C. in the early 1980s as a national correspondent for USA Today when it began, and then so everything sort of went from there. Retired a few years ago and have now started writing books. So but my family still has deep roots there. My mother, after my father passed away, has moved into a assisted living center, and her grandson is now moved on to the family farm. So there's the family acreage, and so that's been kind of the history of the family of sort of transcending relationships and so still deeply rooted there.
Mhm. And you said you're in Virginia now,
Yes.
uh, Alexandria, right? And
Live
and you've been there for
about 40 years.
about
Yeah.
40 years. Okay, great.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, let's turn now to the subject of our conversation today, Corabelle Fellows. Tell us who she was and where she came from. Who is this character?
She was a young woman. She was born in the Midwest, born in Illinois, but her parents moved around the country a little bit. during the Civil War in that era. Her father was tried to join the Union Army and was rejected because of physical problems, and was so ashamed that he went to prospect in Mexico during the war and came back after the war, and they moved to Washington, D.C., where he had jobs around the Capitol. He was a clerk for the federal government or whatever. But Corabelle grew up here at a time of great here, I mean, being in D.C., at a time of great transformation in our country and in Washington, D.C. As a little girl, she played among the boulders of the Washington Monument as it was being built. And so she saw a lot of that positive change herself. She was a very independent girl as a young child, and very smart, started her own school at age 19 here, enrolled like 20 children for a couple of years, and was sent west after she had a relationship with a much older man. Her parents thought he was some sort of a British nobleman or whatever, and so she went west and went into the seminary and studied religion, and then decided to go to the Dakota Frontier, actually the Nebraska Territory, or Nebraska, in 1884 at a 23-year-old woman. She arrives there on Thanksgiving Day in 1884 in the middle of nowhere at Springfield, South Dakota. And I can't imagine. She was 5 foot tall. She weighed about 100 pounds. And so this diminutive but very fiercely independent woman standing out in the middle of this town, which was 2 or 3 years old. I can't imagine what was going through her head at that moment. But long story short, she became a missionary and teacher on many, including on the Riggs missionary outpost in Dakota Territory in the 1880s. And so she was very interesting, very educated, a very good writer, and later in her life would write her own handwritten memoirs while she was blind. So
Mm.
someone I wish I could have met in person.
Yes.
Yeah,
So your uh, part of her life
yeah.
is writing about a particular part of her life that really impacts the rest of us, and also tells a story about our social climate. What's that story about?
Well, it's interesting, and there's a real connectedness to today with her story. And I think sometimes I think we compartmentalize history. We set history aside of something in the past. History to me is a living enterprise. It's something that it connects us with meaning, but it also connects us with knowledge, and it connects us with learned and unlearned lessons from the past. And there are unlearned lessons as well as learned lessons from her history. My story, the story I came across this story of Corabelle in 1989 when I was at Stanford University and doing a fellowship, and my fellowship was on political migration and how people migrated and how it affected American politics. And so this was before the internet, and I was doing a bunch of research in the libraries there. And a lot of it had to do with going back through old newspapers on microfilm, which a lot of our younger viewers probably don't even know, have had no experience with. But in scrolling through those I ran across a St. Paul, Minnesota newspaper from 1888, in which it had a half-page ad, and it advertised Corabelle Fellows and her new husband, Sam Campbell, who was a native man, half white, half native, educated, very smart man. And but they had gone on what we call now the freak show circuit, basically. They were called dime museums at the time, where people would go to see, the bearded lady or the man who wrestled a bear, and all these oversized and caricatured attractions that were a big part of American social life and cultural life in the 1880s. And I thought at that time there's got to be a story about how this young woman ended up with this young man, and to be kind of held out in, I wouldn't say ridicule, but certainly the freak show circuit was not a benevolent platform. And but so I said there had to have been a story how they arrived there and how they were sensationalized and all that sort of thing. And boy, did I find out there was a story there. So, but it took me, until 2018 to get back to that story. But through the years, I'd been collecting sort of, background material on her, and then maybe we can get into this later. But I got really lucky, as I did in my first book, found a family member who had kept her memoirs, and a lot of her artifacts and photographs and that sort of thing, and was able to find her. So,
Well, I think the question that's kind of connected to that is how did she end up in a freak show? Well, what did
she
what how
she
did
got married, and her parents disowned her.
mm,
And her mother was a socialite here in Washington, D.C. They're both buried in Congressional Cemetery here, Homer and Cornelia. And her mother and her family basically disowned her, and the press got a hold of it and sensationalized it as this educated white woman who had married, and I'm going to use a word here that's going to sound harsh, but I think it needs to be said, a savage. And
mhm,
and she and so it was this construct of this of white civilization that had embraced the native man, and this woman from the white civilization embraced the native man, and the press just took it and ran with it. And they were she left her job. I don't know if she was asked to leave or if she'd left. I never was able to ascertain that. But they were offered this very large sum of money. Today, it would be hundreds of thousands of dollars. And she thought she was going on this educational circuit. And Sam kind of went along. Her husband kind of went along as a good husband would, I think, but was, I think, probably, not comfortable with it. In fact, a lot of the interviews that were done with the two as they traveled across the country, and they became very, very famous. They became like household words, and people from all over the country were writing about them, making stuff up about them mainly. And I maintain in the book that that situation, her being disowned by her own family, in particular her mother, and the sensationalist press that surrounded them. Everything that they did, people would write about. And I maintain in the book that that was the beginning of what we call the yellow press in American history. This sensationalism, a lot of it's made up and whatever, and that kind of twinned with that in the culture with the dime museums,
right.
uh, and what was going on with what we call now the freak shows. So,
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned the word educational,
right,
uh, because I think in some sense it was educational in the sense that most people had never seen anything like that and could not imagine anything like that. So as dehumanizing and humiliating as it was, I think it you can't deny the educational component in terms of transferring information. And it
right,
should also be said that savage was the word that the doctrine of discovery, which came from the Pope,
right.
used and basically gave all of those colonialists and other people permission to treat the native people in that way. That edict came from it was a papal bull.
Yeah,
And recently I call him a saint, but Pope Francis, he recently apologized for that, you know.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. That's a
So
very
that
good point. But on your point, Lawrence, I think it's very interesting, and it's a very, very insightful point in the sense that she felt that it was important for her because she loved this man, and he loved her, and that to them that's what mattered in the moment. And there was a lot going on in that period of 1888 and 1889. There was a lot of pressure being brought down on Native people in the Dakota Territory to sign off on the Dawes Act and to essentially take 160 acres of land and then give away other rights and whatever. So not only was that, so she felt like it was an educational thing to say, look, we're a mixed race couple that are making a go of it at a time when it's really there's a lot of turmoil, but it's our love that's pushing us through on this thing. And I think there was probably a little bit of in fact there was a lot of idealism in it. I think she was an idealistic person. I think she felt like love could win out in this thing. And the thing that really strikes me about her and her personality was she never took a bitterness out of that. She took it as a I think she believed that what she had done was incremental in this whole system. It wasn't transformational, but she never really, even after her marriage broke up under the pressure of all of this national sensational stuff, and there was pressure from her family and pressure from his family, she never lost that sense of, there's a better way forward. And I was trying to get there, and I was trying to teach people how to do it. And there were a number of interactions that she would have with people along the way that she felt like were good, were important, and were very vital to because she knew she could see the change that was coming to that area of the country, and there was an inevitability about that change. And she felt like, as a being a person that was as living through that maybe she could educate people. So.
Mm, mm. Let's talk a little bit then about why you came to write the book. There's lots of books a person could write. Why
Right.
did you write this book?
I felt is I try to write a little bit about this in the forward of the book, but I have deep roots in that part of the country. I love that part of the country. I love visiting, and I like going back. I have a lot of friends there and whatever. But as deep as I feel my roots were there were people there that were there before me, and I don't think there's a recognition of that enough. I think in that area of the country of how deeply rooted people are to that landscape, from different perspectives and different races and whatever. And so, and I also thought this is going to sound kind of corny, but the other thing that attracted me was I was a journalist through the years, and I'm ashamed of what the journalism profession did in the late 19th century. And so those two together, I think, were sort of motivating factors for me to say, look, here's how sensationalism can ruin a person's life or change a person's life. And so I was trying to twin those two together. And also I was trying to make the point that we tend to look at history as something that can't happen again because we've learned lessons from history. But if you look at it from their experience, there was a racial divide. Well, there still is divides on many fronts today. We still have that today. We have that in many aspects of our American society. There was we look at back at freak shows as something that's in the past. But as I maintain in the book, have you seen reality TV today? And so there's that transformational thing there's that connectedness that's not transformational. It's kind of the same as it was. And then the impact of the sensationalist press and how, stories that are either pushed way beyond their meaning, they're used to caricature people and whatever, can really be harmful in the macro and the micro. And in this circumstance, I think it was.
Hmm. Yes, I agree with that, and I would add to your example of freak shows, the tabloids, you
Oh yeah.
know,
Oh
and
yeah.
the and the
Absolutely.
and the Geraldos, that where they're more psychological freaks, but it still is a lot of showing, well, the other, and educational. And in fact, one might say that, it's just being aware of it. The brain wants to reject it and not even see it, first of all.
Right.
And so that first introduction is the tip of the spear. You almost have to like have that for people to like have their mind blown so that they can start to accept that there are other things beside the person who sits next to them in church, and there are other lifestyles
Right.
beside.
Right. Exactly. Yep.
Yeah.
And I think it's harder. It's increasingly harder, I think, to do that because of the power of modern media and just it's total in those days you had to sit down and make a conscious effort to read a newspaper or you know and you learn but today it's just it's cascades over you all the time. You walk into stores or you get into elevators or out here, I don't know if it's that way in South Dakota. I don't know if I ever run into it, but some gas stations here you're pump your gas and you're getting advertising or news stories or whatever. So it's
Yeah.
just this constant thing that you have to sort of contextualize in your own life. And I think that was the sort of the beginning of it, the beginning of the sort of the culture of exploitation, in the culture itself, and beyond the civilization, just in the culture, and that sort of started then. So
You bet. And I think you hit the nail on the head when you say, look, it's advertising, I mean,
yeah,
like it's a way to make money.
right.
Uh, but it's also the reason it can make money is because people are curious.
Oh
You know,
yes, yeah.
there's a curious streak among people, and when they see something that they haven't seen before, the brain just has to do a lot of gymnastics to even see it, let alone to make any kind of mental image about what you think about it.
Oh
I,
yes,
I can remember the first time I came through South Dakota many
yep,
years ago, and every time we would stop at the gas station, everything in the gas station would stop. You know,
yeah.
all of
Oh yeah, right.
it. Like, but in that part of the world, they had never seen it, or like once I was in Nepal and I went into this place where they were th- there were these women who were Tibetan women, kind of refugees, and they were weaving rugs,
Yes.
and it was a whole women's thing. So they were chatting and chatting and chatting, and I walked in, and the place it was silent. And then the guy who was like he was the manager of it. He looked at me and he said, "Wherever you came from, it must be really hot because you are black." you know, and I mean, his mind was trying to make sense of like, what am I seeing here? It's like, what happened? What is it? Uh, but
Oh,
at any rate, I think it's part of the human experience to be, to be amazed when you see
I
something
totally
for the
agree.
first time.
I totally agree. We ran into the same thing, and it gave me an understanding of what, the experience you just described. We were in Vietnam about 3 years ago, and we
Mm,
were the only people walking down many, many streets.
mm,
And first of all, it was hotter than blazes there, so we were just perspiring, way beyond the normal.
mm,
And when we were first there, we would be approached by young children who just want to come up and touch us, and we thought, and then they would start talking to us in English, and
mm.
we thought they were just treating us as, as your experience was, and it turns out they wanted to come. They had a benevolent, they had an educational reason to come up to us. They wanted to practice their English with us because
Oh
they
yeah,
were learning English in their schools. And one of their teachers pulled us aside once and said, in English, he said,
right.
I hope you're okay with this because this is an opportunity for these kids. And we
Exactly.
originally seen it as a confrontation or an obstacle, and it turned out to be they were reaching to us to try to understand our language.
Yeah.
And it's a very different experience. But I totally understand what you must have felt in those early, those early days there as well too. And it was, frankly, because as a white person that we don't see it as much, it was uncomfortable in the beginning. It really was. And then once we learned the reason for it, then it became
Right.
bracing thing. So
Yeah, sure, sure.
yeah,
Well, I didn't want to go off too much on a tangent, but I think that was really relevant to
right,
say that, like if when you think about these freak shows and things like that, that it is part of, when you see something the first time, your brain has to go through a lot of gymnastics to just to see it. You don't even really see it at first
right.
because your brain doesn't know what to do with the data, that incoming data, as they say.
Exactly. And then I think there's also in particular in the case of Corabelle and Sam, I think um, it wasn't an unfamiliarity. It was a sensationalism about it that was something that people didn't see every day. And my theory is they were very, very pop. 30,000 people saw them in St. Paul the first week they were there. And St. Paul wasn't that big.
Yeah.
And my theory is that this was the time when the great white immigration came to that part of the country, and it was a lot of people from Northern Europe and Central Europe that came over and were living in tenement housing and working in factories and probably not living the American dream that they saw. And
Mm,
for a dime, which was a decent amount of money but wasn't overly a lot of money at that point. For a dime, they could go see these things that took them out of the mundane aspects of their daily lives. And, a lot of it was made up. I mean, guys wrestling bears and things like that. I think it was also one of the reasons why or Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, which Corabelle and Sam were on for a while,
Mm.
so popular that it showed an aspect of the West that was sensationalized and unfamiliar, and in little ways kind of a little bit dangerous. And so I think it took people out of that sort of the mundane parts of their lives into that. So
Exactly. Well, let's talk a little bit about the process of actually getting this information,
yeah.
because that takes a lot of work.
Oh yeah. And I did a lot of this research through during COVID. So a couple of the places that I had intended to go to to do research were closed or had restricted hours. So I had to work around that. But and that's a very good point, Lawrence. And I want to make, and I think people don't understand um, the tools we have now to go back and connect to history. And to me, there is no excuse any longer for getting it wrong. One of the things that I've discovered in all of my research is that there is this sort of confirmation bias that goes on and on and on, where one person writes it in a book, it's cited in another book, and it's cited in another book. And there had been a book written about Corabelle in 1935, and Corabelle had, when she was in her 70s and she was blind and living in Wichita, Kansas, had written her life story up to the point of her marriage. She didn't continue after that. Um, and a woman down in Wichita who was a ghostwriter got a hold of the story, wrote a book, didn't even give her credit in the cover of the book, and sort of appropriated it as her own story. And my theory is that she was trying to. That was the same year that Little House on the Prairie had come out. That her book came out, and she was trying to replicate the Little House on the Prairie, which was a very popular book at the time. And she wrote the book as a happy ending. Didn't write about the freak show circuit. Didn't write about the sensationalism in the newspaper and all whatever. And so when I found out that there had been a book about it, and I knew that there was a major story beyond the book, I thought there's got to be a reason why she did this, and that was the reason I came up with that she thought she wanted a happy ending like Little House on the Prairie, and when in fact it wasn't a happy ending for Corabelle. And so that to me that sort of tells us that to me also was kind of a marker of the time. I don't think she could have written a book in 1935 about interracial marriage that would have been accepted like it was in 2022 and 23. I just don't think in 1935 America, in particular the way Native Americans were being portrayed in the popular genre of the time, which was big screen films, bloodthirsty savages that were out to kill every white person that came within 10 miles of them. And so I think it was kind of that was kind of an eye opener that's the way the book ended. And so I ended up trying to do, as Paul Harvey would say, the rest of the story.
Yes. I want to get back to that, but I
Yeah.
want to open it up to our esteemed panel here who have joined us and may have questions or comments or other parts of the story. And I think there were a few questions also in the chat.
Mhm.
So anybody have questions that you'd want to ask? Betty looks
Trying to remember what I wanted to ask. This is fascinating to me for many reasons. Can you tell me when she was affiliated with no, it's the name of the guy that wrote the Dakota dictionaries. You mentioned that she,
Riggs,
he,
the Riggs family.
yes, thank you. Because my native grandmother taught school with them. She was Scottish and Dakota. And I'm just intrigued about that. I can hardly wait to get my hands on your book.
What was the name? What was her name? If I might recognize the name. Do you have her name?
Okay. Well, her English name is Jane Anderson Robertson. Her Dakota name translates to Daybreak Woman. And there is a wonderful book that I am glad I don't have to write that was published about her out of Minnesota Historical Society years ago.
The name does not immediately ring a bell, but I do have researched of all of the teachers at Santee and that sort of thing. She was there. She worked for both the rigs and for the government off and on between 1884 and 1888. And then she got married in 1888, but she lived in Dakota Territory until 1891 and kept in touch with a lot of those folks. But
she's quite a bit younger than my grandmother was, because she was there in Minnesota at the time of the uprising. In fact, was run out of Minnesota at that time. So thank you so much. Just carry on. Tell us more.
But no, that's a very good point. And the rigs are important in this book for a couple of reasons. And so I hope you when you get into it, you can have see some relevancy in your own family's experience. But very fascinating people in and of themselves, controversial people both then and now. But I think they're a very, very important part of Dakota Territory and South Dakota history.
Anyone else have questions, comments, anything you want to ask?
Yeah, as you were talking, I think all of us hope that we'll all get along eventually. But I was thinking kind of a strange thing. I'm in South Dakota in the summer, and I've watched a lot how animals will greet each other when they're unfamiliar. And, you learn that animal instinct. And then I was thinking about when, we first started coming over, which tribe was friendly towards the pioneer people and which weren't. And with the current wars and everything going on, there's still that now in my area where there are older people like myself that are in their 70s, 80s, or even 90s, still carry that old frontier idea of who the Native American people are. And I don't think that we're going to really figure this out. I think that there's some sort of natural instinct where when something's different and something's new, we're always afraid. I mean, it's nice to think we'll all get along and we won't be suspicious and won't treat each other fairly. But I don't see that it's possible, especially with what's going on, in the Middle East right now. It's a sorry state.
Yeah, I on that point, in the foreword of my book, I tell about, I actually went out and spent a lot of time in the communities that, just passing through them and stopping in the communities that Corabelle was in the 1880s. And some of them have been moved because of the dams up on the river. But I had a very serendipitous moment when I came back from the last community that she had been a teacher in. I got back to my pickup and I opened up the door of the pickup and I turned on the radio to one of the native stations on the Cheyenne River reservations. And they were broadcasting an interview with Tim Gallego. I don't know if you recognize the name, but Tim was a very famous Native American journalist who had just passed away out there. And he was in it, but it was a 20-year-old interview, and it was back during the days when Governor George Mickelson had his reconciliation year of reconciliation to try to get beyond the divides that you talked about. And Tim there were a couple of lines in there where Tim talked about, he said it would be just good to sit down and start breaking bread with people. And so you talked about divides and you talked about divisions and not getting beyond it. And sometimes it's those smaller steps that get us there. And the problem is I don't think on a daily basis that people are taking those smaller steps. There's still too much distance in my mind. And I can, and as someone who hasn't lived in South Dakota for 40 years, it is a palpable feeling. I had stopped and asked about the location of the village Swiftburg for a state highway patrol guy, or not highway patrol, highway engineer. They were working on some roads there, and I stopped, and it was 25 miles away from this little community of Swiftburg. And I asked one of the guys, I said, do you guys know where Swiftbird is? And they'd never heard of it. And these were people that were working on roads in South Dakota. Now, to me, that there's some disconnect there that has to do with daily transactions. It's not a macro thing. It's like we don't go into each other's communities enough, I think, and that I'm speaking there in metaphorically. And we don't go there with an idea to understand. We go there with an idea of what we've been told of what happened in the past. And we still have the ability, I think, to make our own past for the next generation and the generation after that. And that's one of the reasons why I wrote this book, is I wanted people to understand that there was a way through this. And I built it around this old woman's optimism at age 77, when she was writing this book down. She said, I have no regrets. It was hard times. These winters were hard, everything. But the people that she had met, in particular, one Native woman by the name of Elizabeth Winyan, were enough to sustain her for the rest of her life. And she had an understanding. She came to believe, after her mother had disowned her, that Elizabeth Winyan was her mother in sort of the Native tradition.
You know, I'd like to add to that, that a lot of times people think that it's impossible to make these changes. But I say I'm a kind of a living example that yes, we can make we can make changes. And in addition to that, all around the world, I have seen in places where there's the most, vile hatred between people, and there are always people who find a way to reach across and do it. But what we do is we let some people convince us that it's impossible, and then we start to believe it, because they make these huge gross, absurd acts against people, and then you get a kind of a hate barrier going, and then they amplify it, and then they try to make us think that that's the norm, that that's the human norm, where it's not the human norm. The human norm is the thing that you were talking about, and much I've experienced too, is you go in and people are curious about you. It's the first time they've seen people. I remember the first time I left the country and I went to Mexico, and it was the first time. I always remember feeling like I lost my tail because of how people had made me feel what I was. And for the first time, I had people look at me and think, well, we don't know who you are. Tell us who you are. Show us who you are. Right. And I realized that I could write my own script. And from writing my own script, now I find that there's enough people that whenever you go into a new community, that you can write your own script. And then when those people accept you, then you become part of their family and their network. And there are people who are living very nice lives, taking advantage of what humans have to offer each other all over the world. We can do it too.
Yeah. Vicki, I think on Lawrence's point, it's an extremely good point. We felt at the end, we felt when we visited Vietnam, my wife and I visited Vietnam a number of years ago. We felt welcomed in a way that we didn't thought that initially, like I said earlier, we thought they were being sort of put offish toward us, but it was a welcoming. But I don't think that could have happened to that degree had not someone like John McCain gone back and had reconciliation there. Here's a man who was damn near killed, tortured, almost tortured to death in Vietnam, and then late in his life went back and did a very public reconciliation. And if you went there now as an American, 40 years after we were bombing the heck out of that country, you would be embraced in ways that you would be amazed at. And so there can be a hopelessness, I think, in those day-to-day, and I hear you fully on those transactions. And there is racism toward Native Americans.
I was wondering if you were blaming it more on the press, or whether you were blaming it on a natural instinct that people have towards newness and strangers, like a survival instinct, or it's both. I don't know.
I don't think blame is not the word that I would use for the press. I think it was exploitation of something that was very evident there. I mean, obviously there was racism at the time. I think it was an exploitation, but the point that Corabelle tried to make in trying to cut through all of that din was you can do it if you love someone, and you can do it, you can try, at least you can try to advance it if you love someone. And to me, the fact that she was able to form this incredibly close relationship with a Native woman who had nothing in common with her. I mean, this is a remarkable Native woman who, at age 2, she was, her village had been overrun by another tribe, and she'd spent 2 days under a overturned kennel, hiding from the other tribe, and her mother came back and got her, and she was during the aforementioned 1862 Minnesota raid, she helped save the Riggs family. And so she had done a number of things to try to conciliate through the years. And the fact that those two women got together and were out ministering together and helping to, they were dealing with a lot of the Sitting Bulls people that had come back from Canada that were trying to reestablish in the Northern Plains, and some of the tremendous hardships they went through together. But she remembered her in ways that were just loving and respectful. But the point is that the first book that had been written about her, the woman took that relationship and completely turned it on its head. She described Elizabeth Winyan in ways that were not accurate. And so that's part, if you want to talk about blaming the press or blaming authors, there was blame to assume there, because she had taken a story and twisted it on its head. And if you read the book, in the book, I try to explain that relationship and how it had been totally mischaracterized in the first book that had been written about the two. And again, I think it was cognizant of the times where you could not, it wasn't a good thing. I mean, even in Little House on the Prairie, the Native people were considered, others.
Let's move. Anybody else have any questions, comments, rebuttals? Okay, let's talk.
I'm wondering, Lawrence, if there's a couple things in the chat that might be good to.
Yes, can you go through them?
Yeah, so one most recent one comes from Cindy Wilson, a fellow author. She says, I finished your fantastic book a few days ago and was especially taken by Elizabeth Winyan, and I'm inspired to learn more about her. I live in southern Minnesota, not far from Swan Lake area, so could picture her childhood environs in the book. Can you talk more toward why the writer of Blue Star turned her into such a different character?
I think it's an extremely important question. And I think part of it was, as I said earlier, I think it was a nod to the times. I just don't think that it would have been totally accepted in that context of 1935. I mean, if you looked at the broader culture in 1935, if you look at the movies that were being put out about natives, they were still being seen as enemies. And so a deeply emotional relationship between the two women would have been hard to, I think, characterize at that point. The other thing is that a lot of her own family lost the story of her. I've heard from members of Elizabeth Winyan's family who said they really did not know much about grandmother. They knew about her great grandmother, but they knew about her son who had become a very famous pastor in Christian pastor in northeast South Dakota around the turn of the century, and so they were, so it was that sort of those two things, and also I think there was also a kind of sense that at the time of that when Corabelle was writing her memoirs, that she also was going back in her own life and kind of reassessing her own relationships, and had realized late in her life how important that relationship was for her. And so I think sometimes you don't recognize what's right before you. And sometimes when you look back on your life in repose, some things that weren't important for you become extremely important later in your life. And I think that's where a lot of the laments of humans come from. I wish I would have done this and this, and I wish I would have done this and that. But Elizabeth Winyan was an amazing character, and it's kind of amazing in 2023 to hear from members of her family who say, I did not know this about my family.
I think one of the relative, I guess you could say, people who were in her same time, contemporaries, that's the word I was looking for, Oscar Micheaux.
Yes.
who wrote, he actually wrote stories about interracial marriages, and he walked across South Dakota selling his books door to door.
Yeah.
And went on to make movies from the books. So it's an interesting take. Now, whether or not he self-published his books. So sometimes I think it's like editors
Yeah.
who change books because they don't think, oh, I can't see that, that the marketing part. Yeah.
Right. Right.
And
That
so
one.
and especially when books are like when they are taken to investors, to say, hey, would you back this book? They have to sell it to the investors, and the investors have to think, well, you have to convince them that there's going to be a payback. I think whenever you run a book through, the cash register, it comes out different than when it went in.
Well, and that's a very good point, and that's sometimes that's my problem with historical fiction. I personally, I believe historical fiction, there's a reason for the genre, and there's some really good historical fiction out there, but historical fiction sometimes can really be damaging in the total picture of understanding. Like I had a friend who was a scholar on John F. Kennedy, and he blames Oliver Stone for corrupting an entire generation of Americans to believe that, some weird dude from New Orleans was involved in shooting Kennedy,
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. Any more before we continue?
I'm going to throw out one more that came from Facebook, I believe, that someone asked, they're curious to know how the freak show circuit billed them as a couple. What were their stage names used to draw the patrons in? Was it simply that it's a native man and a white woman? How did they promote that, so to speak?
Find it in here. Could show you in my book. Let me see if it's right here. Can you see that?
Raise it up a little bit. Yes. Okay.
It depicted
exactly.
She loves a savage.
Yeah.
Jack, his lovely bride. By the way, they'd mischaracterized Sam Campbell, who was a very handsome young man of about age 25 when he got married to Corabelle. She was about 28. And some reporter from Pier at the time, who had never met them, got a picture of like a 75-year-old man and sent it east, and they drew etchings of that. And so that's how he was depicted, as a 75-year-old native man who was basically coming in and taking over this woman. And so that was part of it. But no, they were depicted in their own names. I think in part to play off this conflict within the family. But it's interesting what Lawrence said earlier about which is very on point. There was a contemporaneous marriage between a native man and a white woman, Elaine Goodman and Charles Eastman, and Charles was a very famous native doctor, Sioux doctor, who was one of the first doctors to come upon Wounded Knee after the battle, or after the massacre, and came upon Wounded Knee, and he married this socialite from New York City, high society socialite. Actually, she was from Massachusetts, but they got married in New York City. Over 100 newspapers covered it, and they were treated benevolently in the press. So it wasn't just race that was dividing people at the time; it was class. Eastman had gone to Harvard. Sam Campbell, the husband of Corabelle, was, he was an educated man, but he hadn't gone to Harvard. He hadn't, and he hadn't built a name for himself. Eastman had been writing in a lot of Eastern newspapers about what was going on in Dakota Territory. So they were a known quantity, and that marriage was embraced. The families embraced it. Everybody thought it was great. At the same time, Corabelle and this other marriage, this other interracial marriage, was depicted as part of a freak show. And so it goes to show you, it's just not the color of one's skin, but it's from where one comes from in American culture and American history that sometimes divides us needlessly. My contention is, of the four of them, all of them, well, three of the four of them wrote books. And of all of them, the best writer was Corabelle. And she had written for Riggs newspapers and other things. She was an eloquent writer, but the other two were more famous and got published a lot more.
Yeah. Well, one of the interesting things is how after the Louisiana Purchase, there was a concerted effort to drive a wedge between the native people and Europeans. And there's actually a whole book written on it. I'm blanking on the name now, but it was a woman who was a professor in Minnesota, and she wrote this book. Come to me maybe, but I remember going to one of her lectures, and she talked about how before the Louisiana Purchase, the natives and the French people were getting along pretty well, right? And you can see the result in a lot of names and marriages that happened there, that it wasn't a newspaper article, at all. It was just a normal thing. After the Louisiana Purchase, the people came up and they purposely wrote things, started newspapers, wrote books to talk about how this was abnormal and people couldn't get along and they shouldn't get along, and wasn't God's will for them to be together. That was concerted effort. It wasn't an accident.
Right. And it was
then, so people could live together until somebody decided that they shouldn't.
Well, there's also, and I do go into this a little bit in the book too, there was also an aspect of interracial marriage on the frontier where it was seen as more acceptable for men to marry Native women than for Native men to marry white women. And there's a whole cultural thing, but it kind of went back to the fact that a lot of the white men that were on the frontier were traders and scouts, and had needs, and and so that was an accepted thing. But women that would marry, for women to go, it was different. You were going outside your culture, you were denying your culture, you were thinning your blood, which was the term at that point. And so
it's recently became a point again.
Yeah, exactly. And so you don't just have race, you don't just have class, you also have gender involved in this. And so, I mean, all of these debates are familiar today, right? About gender and race and class. And so, we just sort of, I don't know if we've sophisticated them or unsophisticated them today, but they certainly are there. So,
yeah. So very, very interesting points. Tell us, as we're getting near the end of our time, I would like you to expound, if you will, on how your book speaks to us today. What does it say to us today?
Well, I think it says that you have choices in how you confront these, and Corabelle had choices. After she and Sam got divorced in, I'd say, early 1890s, I think he couldn't handle the pressure of the marriage. He'd never been accepted by her family. I think she was, and he left the home, and then he came back for a while, and then he left for good. And so I think that could have embittered that woman. And then what happened to her after that? She had 3 young children with him. A couple of them had been gone with them on the freak show circuit, or one of them had gone with them on the freak show circuit in the second year, and he'd been exploited. There were headlines about this 1-year-old boy, come see the papoose. Was one of the ads that was put out. And so she had a deep well that she could have drawn of bitterness for the rest of her life. And then basically, I think for economic reasons, she was so poor that she ended up marrying this man 20 years her senior, who was a Civil War veteran and who, by all accounts, was not a good man. I think was abusive of her and whatever. And he died in the 1920s. And then when she started writing her story in the 1930s, she could have been really bitter about her life, but she chose to focus on the good parts of it and the hope. She didn't gloss over some of the challenges that she'd had and that sort of thing. And so I think that was one of the things that I learned from this, is that it's up to you how you respond to it. And she really embraced the sort of the hope and opportunity. She said, they may not understand what I went through, her in speaking of her grandchildren, but she says, I hope they're proud that I went through it. And And so she felt like, you know, she had left a legacy of that. And I think to draw to the sort of the final point on that is that I think, and I've had many conversations with members of Corabelle's current descendants. We've had Zoom calls and all sorts of things. They've learned things about her that they didn't know. And I think they've reached sort of a new level of understanding and appreciation of her and what she went through. And I would hope that maybe that influences their own daily lives. It certainly has mine, knowing her story. So,
Do you think there's a movie in the making? I mean,
you know, I don't know. I mean, I yeah.
read Oscar Michaud. He might give you some tips. You know.
Right, exactly. I actually have a daughter-in-law who's in the movie industry. She's financial producers for some movies, but you know that's really hard, and that's not, you know, if it happens, it would happen. But I think, you know, and frankly, there are a number of books that have been made into movies that are probably much better vehicles for that now, including, you know, Killers of the Flower Moon, which is out now, you know, which is a totally different book, but I think touches on some of the same subjects. And so, yeah, so no, I don't know. I wish the story could be told to all kids on native and non-native and mixed race and whatever, particularly in the Dakotas, where I think one of the really earlier questions, I think, really hit on some points of the sort of the lingering divides that are there that we need to confront. We can't let them sit for generations and generations. And that's where I think George Mickelson had the right motives, and then, you know, and then he was tragically taken away. So
Right. I think that's a key point, is how do we use books like yours to keep the history in front of people, or in many cases, to put it in front of people who've never heard about things like this. What are some other ways, if it's for those people who don't have the luxury of leisure time to read?
yeah, well,
What are some other ways?
that's a good point. I think you can educate yourself on what's going on right now, or at least be open to understanding why banning books, to me, is such a dangerous path to go down. And I think also to demand of your politicians, when they say they want to take hold of the history that you want to tell, that you ask them, well, why? What about history do you want to tell? And my answer in the book is let's tell all of it. And to be open, I think, to understanding that what you've been told and what you've been led to believe through the generations may not be entirely the truth, and to understand and to sort of open your heart and open your mind into that. And then also in your day-to-day, I guess, interactions with people, to not necessarily look at the bad part or to look for a transgression first, but to look for that sort of common ground first. And maybe it's just a remark in the grocery store, you know, to say, hey, that's a nice hat, or something like that, you know, that you can do on that to, you know, to try to make your community more of a, you know, all-inclusive community.
Yes. I think that's you've brought that point at least one other time that I can think of. It's like those little things that we can do. And a lot of times we give short shrift to how much we can do. We give away our power and then complain that we don't have it. But
Right.
but the real power is in exactly what you're saying. The little things that you can drop. You know, it's kind of like the teacher who speaks for 50 minutes, and some little aside during that 50 minutes is what the whole class remembers.
Right. Right.
So it's the little things that you say that you can share, the little niceties that you can do with and for people, getting out of your comfort zone and going to a powwow, going to a reservation, going to a church that's not the one you go to usually every Sunday. Because as much as we can make about the divides between larger groups, if you can't get Lutheran Church A to go and share a service with Lutheran Church B, you know, that's a problem. I mean, and that sort of speaks to, like, you know, it's bigger than and deeper than just this so-called race thing.
Right. Well, I'm a Methodist. I know that what's going on right now is certainly to that point.
Exactly. Well, we've come to the end of our road, so to speak. And I'd like to thank everybody for coming and joining in this conversation, and would like to invite you to join us next week, same time, same station. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.